I'm watching U.S. Navy ships move out of Bahrain in real time, and I need you to sit with this for a moment. This isn't routine. It isn't an exercise. The American Embassy in Israel sent a message telling personnel to leave immediately, not soon, not when it's convenient, today. Ambassador Mike Huckabee was direct. If you're going, get on a plane now because commercial flights may not be available much longer. And while that warning was going out, Iran was already firing dozens of ballistic missiles at American bases across the Gulf. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, installations in the UAE, Kuwait, multiple sites under attack at the same time. One person in Abu Dhabi is already dead, killed by debris from an interceptor missile. Just think about that. You're at home, and fragments from a missile defense system fall through your roof. That's how close this is. It didn't stop there. Qatar shut down its airspace. The UAE followed. Kuwait, Bahrain, skies closed as missiles crossed overhead, air defense systems firing over and over, videos circulating of explosions near U.S. Navy facilities in Bahrain. The night sky over Doha, flashing with impact after impact. But here's what people aren't focusing on. Earlier that same day, before any of this retaliation, the U.S. and Israel carried out what they described as a preemptive strike on Iran. Targets in Tehran, Isfahan, Kermanshah, multiple cities, and reports indicate it wasn't limited to military infrastructure. Iranian leadership sites were reportedly hit, including residences tied to the supreme leader in downtown Tehran. Now, this changes the frame entirely. For weeks, the Pentagon had been building up forces in the region. Two carrier strike groups, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford, deployed with more than a dozen warships, F-22 fighters, aerial refueling tankers. That's not symbolic, that's preparation. And then President Trump went on record saying this operation could lead to regime change in Iran. He used words like annihilation, elimination. At the same time, Iran's Revolutionary Guard warned that any base assisting the U.S. or Israel would be considered a legitimate target. This is the part that kept me up last night. 20% of the world's oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. If Iran closes it, and they have the capacity, we're looking at an oil shock that makes 1973 seem minor. Prices are already rising on fear alone. But the deeper issue is what happened in the 48 hours before the strikes. There were indirect talks in Geneva between the U.S. and Iran, mediated by Oman. Iran's foreign minister described them as positive. The U.S. signaled progress too. And then less than a day later, missiles were flying. There are also reports that the justification for the strikes claims that Iran is close to fielding missiles capable of reaching the United States, conflict with U.S. intelligence assessments. The same agencies that brief the president daily are reportedly saying something different behind closed doors. During the State of the Union 3 days ago, Trump said Iran's missiles could soon reach the U.S. Yet officials have been telling reporters Iran does not have intercontinental capability and isn't near it. Then there's the uranium question. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said Iran was about a week away from industrial-grade bomb material because enrichment hit 60%. A week. Then Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Iran is not enriching right now, but is trying to reach that point eventually. Those are very different statements. So which is it? And this didn't begin today. In June 2025, the U.S. and Israel carried out Operation Midnight Hammer. Trump referenced it again, saying Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo and Isfahan were obliterated, deep underground sites built into mountains to withstand airstrikes. If that program was destroyed 9 months ago, why are we launching another major campaign now? What changed? Or was it ever fully dismantled? Then China ordered its citizens to evacuate Iran immediately. Not advisory language. An order. It also urged citizens in Israel to heighten security. China does not issue that kind of directive casually. Airlines are reacting. KLM suspended flights to Tel Aviv. Other carriers are rerouting around the region. The FAA will soon have to decide whether U.S. airlines can operate near the Gulf at all. If not, international travel disruption becomes immediate. And Iran's Revolutionary Guard described these attacks as the first wave. Not retaliation, first wave. That implies more. Footage verified by multiple sources shows ballistic missiles striking a logistics facility at Naval Support Activity Bahrain. A direct hit. Casualty numbers haven't been released. In Qatar, 3 missiles were intercepted above Al Udeid by Patriot systems, barely in time. Aircraft had reportedly been evacuated hours earlier, suggesting U.S. Central Command anticipated retaliation. The UAE intercepted several missiles, not all, and their air defenses are among the most advanced in the world. That detail matters. Explosions were also reported in Kuwait near areas hosting U.S. Army Central. Jordan intercepted ballistic missiles headed toward its territory. Saudi Arabia heard blasts over Riyadh. This isn't isolated to one base or one country. Iran is signaling to every Gulf state, if you host American forces, you are part of this. Qatar condemned the strikes as a violation of sovereignty. The UAE called them a dangerous escalation. These governments have spent years trying to balance relationships with Washington and Tehran. They didn't want to choose. Now they may not have that option. And here's something that hasn't received much attention. U.S. personnel were already being quietly moved out of Al Udeid days before the missiles launched. Hundreds of non-essential staff relocated over the past week. The Pentagon knew retaliation was coming. They knew likely targets, and still, we are here. Iran didn't wake up and decide to act impulsively. After Operation Midnight Hammer last June, Tehran spent months rebuilding its missile arsenal. Satellite imagery earlier this year showed new production facilities coming online. This wasn't hidden. It was visible, which brings us back to Geneva. Positive talks, indirect negotiations, discussions about enrichment limits and inspection frameworks. Sources said there was movement toward compromise, and then strikes began before anything could be finalized. That timing raises uncomfortable possibilities. Either the talks were never serious, or someone decided diplomacy had run its course and acted before it concluded. President Trump framed the objective as freedom for the Iranian people and safety for the region. In the same breath, he spoke about annihilating Iran's navy and eliminating the Revolutionary Guard. Those are two very different visions of outcome. It's hard to reconcile liberation rhetoric with the destruction of an entire military infrastructure. The Pentagon has long-standing contingency plans for Iran. These are not limited to precision hits on nuclear sites. They include dismantling command structures, naval forces, air defenses, missile facilities, comprehensive campaigns, updated for years. And if this is the beginning of that campaign, it won't unfold in isolation. Iran has proxy networks across the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon with a vast missile arsenal, militias in Iraq capable of targeting U.S. forces, the Houthis in Yemen who have already demonstrated strike capability against Saudi and Emirati targets. Those relationships don't disappear overnight. Then there is the Strait of Hormuz again. Iran doesn't need a conventional naval battle to disrupt it. Sea mines, shore-based anti-ship missiles, submarines, even limited interference could halt global oil shipments temporarily. The U.S. Navy would have to conduct extensive mine-clearing operations under threat. If that waterway closes for even a short period, energy markets react immediately. Strategic reserves buy time, not certainty. And beyond energy, global supply chains tighten. Inflation pressures rise. Iran has prepared for this type of confrontation for decades. Hardened facilities, dispersed assets, redundant command systems, a military structure to continue operating even if leadership nodes are hit. This isn't Iraq in 2003. It's a country that endured 8 years of war in the 1980s and didn't collapse. And then another layer emerged. Iran's exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi released a message calling on military leaders to side with the people and support regime change, offering immunity to those who lay down arms. That signals expectations about where this could head. But regime change in the Middle East carries its own history. Past interventions produced instability, extremist movements, prolonged reconstruction efforts. Those outcomes shape how analysts are evaluating this moment. There is no scenario here that resolves neatly. Either rhetoric cools and escalation slows, or cycles of retaliation continue. Economic repercussions alone could be significant if this extends beyond days into weeks. And those two carrier strike groups in the Gulf, the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald R. Ford, each carry thousands of personnel and extensive aircraft wings. They represent capability, but they are also high-value assets in waters where Iran has focused on asymmetric strategies for years. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, coastal cruise missiles, fast attack craft, sea mines. These are systems designed to complicate traditional naval dominance. The U.S. Navy has not faced a peer or near-peer naval engagement in confined waters in decades. If a carrier were severely damaged, the political and strategic shock would be profound. Casualties at that scale would generate enormous pressure for expanded retaliation. And that is how regional conflict can widen quickly. Israel has advocated for a decisive dismantling of Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure for years. Now there is an administration willing to move in that direction. Yet internal assessments reportedly caution that a comprehensive campaign would require sustained operations over weeks or months, targeting hundreds of hardened sites. During that period, Iran would not remain passive. When the president speaks about elimination, it signals preparation for a level of military engagement not seen in years. But the harder question is what follows. If Iran's governing structure collapses, who fills the vacuum? Opposition groups are fragmented. Exile communities have been outside the country for decades. Iran is a complex society of 90 million people with deep regional connections. History suggests removing a government is one challenge. Building a stable replacement is another entirely. And if instability spreads, Iran's influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, all of those networks shift in unpredictable ways. Power vacuums invite competition. Russia and China are watching closely. Direct intervention would risk broader confrontation, but diplomatic support, arms sales, sanctions relief mechanisms, those are tools available to them. Alignment patterns could shift long term. Domestically, the economic effects would reach American households. Energy costs, inflationary pressure, financial markets reacting to prolonged uncertainty. Policymakers would face difficult trade-offs between stabilizing prices and sustaining growth, which leads to a central question. What defines success? Is it the destruction of nuclear facilities? Is it regime change? Is it dismantling military capacity? Each objective requires a different scale of commitment and carries different consequences. The next 48 hours are pivotal. Iran described this as the first wave. If further strikes occur, responses will follow. Action and reaction can accelerate quickly. Intelligence assessments reportedly indicated Iran would need to respond forcefully to maintain credibility with its population and allies, so retaliation was anticipated. What remains unclear is whether there is a clear off-ramp, a structured path to de-escalation before events outrun intentions. I'm looking at the board, at all the pieces in motion, and I don't see an obvious exit. Where does this go from here? And that uncertainty is the part I keep coming back to. Because once momentum builds in a conflict like this, decisions narrow. Leaders speak in absolutes. Militaries move assets into position. Public expectations harden. And stepping back begins to look like weakness instead of strategy. U.S. intelligence reportedly assessed that Iran could not simply absorb a strike and do nothing. Credibility matters internally as much as externally. So when missiles were launched at Gulf bases, it wasn't spontaneous. It was predictable. What's less predictable is the scale of what comes next. If additional waves follow, and Iran's own statement suggested they would, the United States faces a choice: respond proportionally and hope for containment, or escalate to reestablish deterrence. Each option carries risk. Each one invites another response. There's also the regional dimension. Gulf states hosting U.S. forces are now directly implicated. Even if they preferred neutrality, geography has pulled them in. Airspace closures alone signal how quickly civilian life is disrupted. Airports shut, flights canceled, supply routes altered, energy markets react in minutes. Insurance rates for shipping adjust. Traders anticipate worst-case scenarios. Fear alone moves numbers before any physical disruption occurs. And yet, behind all of this military activity, there's the unresolved diplomatic thread. Negotiations in Geneva had reportedly made incremental progress: enrichment limits, inspection mechanisms, frameworks that, at least on paper, suggested movement. If those talks were genuine, then their collapse marks a profound shift. If they were symbolic, then this escalation was likely inevitable. Either interpretation carries implications about trust and leverage moving forward. There is also the internal American conversation. When rhetoric emphasizes annihilation and elimination, it conditions the public for sustained action. Large-scale operations require political endurance. They require clarity about objectives. Without that clarity, support can erode as costs rise, and costs will rise if this expands. Consider the strategic geography. The Strait of Hormuz remains the most sensitive choke point in global energy supply. Even partial disruption forces, naval deployments, escorts, surveillance operations. Mine clearing under threat is slow, methodical work. It is not dramatic, but it is dangerous. Iran's approach to warfare has long emphasized asymmetry. Rather than matching conventional strength directly, it focuses on exploiting vulnerabilities. Confined waters, dense missile coverage, distributed assets. These factors complicate decisive outcomes. Meanwhile, U.S. carrier groups project power, but they also concentrate personnel and equipment. Their presence is both deterrent and target. The balance between those two realities becomes more fragile the longer tensions persist. If a single high-impact event occurs, major casualties, a vessel severely damaged, the pressure to widen the campaign could intensify rapidly. Political space for restraint would shrink. And then there's the broader international layer. Russia and China may avoid direct military involvement, but diplomatic positioning matters. Vetoes in international forums, expanded trade relationships, sanctions mitigation efforts. These shifts reshape long-term alignments. None of this unfolds in isolation from domestic economies. Oil prices influence transportation, manufacturing, consumer costs. Inflation pressures can return even after periods of stabilization. Central banks face trade-offs they would prefer not to confront. So when we ask about the end game, we're really asking about definition. Is success measured by facilities destroyed, by leadership displaced, by deterrence restored? Each metric implies a different timeline and a different tolerance for escalation. And timelines matter. A short exchange can be absorbed. A prolonged campaign changes global dynamics. The final piece is human. Behind every missile interception, every closed airport, every naval maneuver, there are families watching the news the same way you are. In Abu Dhabi, in Doha, in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, in American cities with loved ones deployed. That human factor influences politics as much as strategy. Casualties alter calculations. Images shape narratives. Narratives influence decisions. Right now, we're in the opening phase of something that could either plateau or expand. The language coming from both sides suggests resolve, not retreat. But rhetoric can shift if incentives shift. The next signals will be critical: further missile launches, expanded target sets, or unexpectedly, a pause. I don't see certainty. I see intersecting risks. I see strategic assets positioned in tight waters. I see diplomatic channels that may or may not still be open. And I see leaders whose words have raised expectations to levels that are hard to unwind. If there is a path back from escalation, it will require intentional choices made quickly, because inertia favors continuation. And once continuation becomes the default, pulling back becomes exponentially harder. So I'll leave you with this. When you look at all of these pieces, the military buildup, the retaliatory waves, the fragile energy corridor, the stalled negotiations, do you see a mechanism that slows this down? Or do you see momentum? I'm still looking. There's another dimension we haven't fully sat with yet, and it's the cumulative weight of all of this happening at once. When multiple systems start straining simultaneously, military, economic, diplomatic, that's when miscalculation becomes most likely. Not because anyone intends it, but because speed replaces reflection. Right now, regional airspace is restricted. Naval assets are repositioning. Intelligence assessments are being updated hour by hour. Markets are reacting in real time. And leaders are speaking publicly in language that leaves very little room for ambiguity. That combination narrows flexibility. If Iran launches another coordinated wave, the United States will feel compelled to respond in a way that reasserts dominance. If that response is broader than anticipated, Iran will answer again. This is how escalation ladders form, each step justified by the one before it. And in that cycle, original objectives can blur. Was the initial goal deterrence? Was it dismantling nuclear capability? Was it regime pressure? As actions compound, clarity can erode. What remains is momentum. There's also the matter of alliances. When Gulf states condemn strikes on their soil while simultaneously hosting U.S. forces, their political balancing act becomes untenable. Domestic populations watch carefully. Regional rivals interpret silence or support as alignment. That reshapes regional politics in ways that don't reverse easily. Energy infrastructure is particularly vulnerable in moments like this. Even without a formal closure of the Strait of Hormuz, targeted disruptions, mining attempts, drone strikes, harassment of tankers can create enough instability to drive sustained price volatility. Insurance markets respond first, then shipping lanes thin, then supply contracts tighten. Those ripple effects reach far beyond the region. At home, economic pressure changes political calculations. Rising fuel prices filter into grocery costs, transportation, manufacturing. Public patience can shift quickly when household budgets are affected. That pressure feeds back into leadership decisions about scale and duration. And then there's military endurance. Sustained operations require logistics, rotation cycles, equipment maintenance. Carrier groups can project force, but long deployments strain personnel and hardware. Extended campaigns demand congressional support, funding allocations, and public backing. If objectives expand while resources stretch, tension builds internally as well as externally. Another factor is information. Conflicting statements about enrichment levels, missile capability, and intelligence assessments create ambiguity. Ambiguity can serve strategic purposes, but it can also undermine trust if discrepancies widen. When leaders cite imminent threats and intelligence officials suggest otherwise, observers begin to question the narrative. That questioning influences international support. And international support matters if sanctions tighten or diplomatic pressure increases. Coalition strength determines leverage. Then consider Iran's internal dynamics. External pressure can unify factions that might otherwise compete. Nationalism intensifies under threat. Even groups critical of leadership can rally against foreign strikes. That complicates assumptions about internal fracture, leading to rapid change. Regime change is often discussed as a linear outcome. History suggests it is rarely linear. If central authority weakens abruptly, peripheral actors move quickly. Militias, regional commanders, rival political movements. Stability doesn't automatically replace collapse. It often takes years to construct, and during that reconstruction, external powers jockey for influence. All of this sits against a backdrop of global strategic competition. While the United States focuses resources in the Gulf, other theaters remain active. Commitments overlap. Priorities compete. That doesn't mean engagement is impossible. It means trade-offs become sharper. So when we ask where this leads, the honest answer is that it depends on restraint as much as resolve. It depends on whether leaders interpret the next strike as a signal to escalate or an opportunity to recalibrate. Signals are powerful in crises. A pause can be as strategic as a strike, but pauses require political space. And political space narrows when rhetoric sets maximal expectations. Right now, the language from multiple sides emphasizes strength and inevitability. That tone energizes supporters. It also reduces flexibility. The next development, whether it's another wave, a targeted retaliation, or a sudden diplomatic outreach, will tell us a great deal about which path is gaining traction. I keep returning to the same image: carrier groups positioned in confined waters, missile batteries activated along coastlines, commercial aircraft rerouted across entire regions, and negotiators who were in the middle of discussions only days ago. That convergence is rare, and it's fragile. If escalation continues, it will not remain contained to one headline or one week. It will shape energy markets, alliance structures, domestic politics, and regional balances for years. If it slows, it will be because deliberate choices were made to absorb political risk in exchange for strategic stability. Those choices haven't been visible yet. And until they are, we're left watching the next 24 to 48 hours unfold, knowing that each move alters the range of possibilities. I don't offer certainty here. I offer concern grounded in the patterns we've seen before. When forces align this tightly, outcomes rarely stay limited by design. They're limited by intervention, by someone deciding that the cost of continuation outweighs the optics of restraint. We'll know soon enough which instinct prevails. And as this continues to unfold, there's a final layer we have to acknowledge. Crises like this are rarely about a single strike or a single